Well, we haven't seen each other. Do you hear seen each other? Do you write? Huh? I read on that answer.
Right.
I really believe he took the initiative for us. Both sort of felt he have the same task.
She was the most desired woman in the world. Yet in the quiet moments of her life, Marilyn Monroe carried a question that never quite left her. Why does love never stay? On screen, she was unforgettable, effortless, adored. But away from the cameras, her story was far more fragile, shaped by longing, disappointment, and a search for something real. She loved more than once. She walked away more than once. And before she died, there was one truth she seemed to understand more clearly than ever. Among all the men who entered her life, there was one who never truly left her. But his love was not the kind the world expected. Before we begin, I'd love to know something about you. How old are you, and where are you watching from today? The life before Marilyn, James Dougherty. Long before the world knew her as Marilyn Monroe, she was simply Norma Jeane, a young girl growing up in uncertainty, moving between foster homes, learning early that stability was something fragile, something that could disappear without warning. Love, in those early years, was not something she experienced as constant. It was something she hoped for, something she needed. And at just 16 years old, she made a decision that would shape the beginning of her adult life. She married James Dougherty. To the outside world, it may have looked like a simple young love story, a teenage girl starting a life with a kind, dependable man. Dougherty was stable, grounded, and far removed from the chaos that would later define Marilyn's life. But beneath that surface, the truth was more complicated. This was not a marriage built on deep emotional connection. It was built on necessity. Norma Jeane needed a place to belong, a sense of security in a world that had never truly offered her one. And Dougherty, in many ways, represented that safety. For a time it worked. She lived a quiet life, a life far removed from cameras, fame, and expectation, a life where she could simply exist without being watched. But something inside her was already beginning to change. As opportunities slowly appeared, modeling, photography, the first small steps into Hollywood, Norma Jeane began to realize that the life she was living was not the life she was meant for. And with that realization came distance. The more she stepped into the world, the further she moved away from the marriage that had once given her stability. The connection that had never been deeply rooted could not hold against the force of who she was becoming. Eventually, the marriage ended, not with drama, not with betrayal, but with quiet understanding. Because sometimes, the love that begins before you know who you are cannot survive the moment you finally discover yourself. And for Marilyn, that was where it all truly began. A life shaped by longing, a heart shaped by searching, and a journey toward a kind of love she had not yet found. The man she loved, but couldn't be herself, Joe DiMaggio. By the early 1950s, Marilyn Monroe had already become something the world had never quite seen before. She wasn't just a rising actress, she was becoming a symbol, a face that audiences couldn't forget, a presence that seemed to exist somewhere between reality and illusion. And it was during this time that she met Joe DiMaggio. He was everything different from Hollywood. Quiet, disciplined, and deeply private, DiMaggio carried himself with a kind of calm authority that felt steady in contrast to the chaos of fame. To Marilyn, that steadiness was comforting. After years of uncertainty and emotional instability, she found something in him that felt safe. Their connection grew quickly. What began as admiration soon turned into something deeper, something that felt real in a world where very little did. They married in 1954. For a moment, it seemed like Marilyn Monroe had finally found the kind of love she had been searching for. A man who would protect her, stand beside her, and perhaps give her the stability she had never truly known. But almost as quickly as it began, something shifted. Joe DiMaggio loved Marilyn. There was no doubt about that. But the version of Marilyn he loved was not the same woman the world had fallen in love with. He wanted privacy. He wanted simplicity. He wanted a wife who belonged only to him. The world, however, wanted something else entirely. They wanted the icon. The moment that seemed to capture this tension forever came during the filming of The 7-Year Itch. As Marilyn stood over a subway grate, her white dress lifting into the night air, crowds gathered, cameras flashed, and the image became instantly unforgettable. To the world, it was magic. To DiMaggio, it was something else. Something personal had been taken and turned into spectacle. Not long after, their marriage began to fracture. Arguments grew, distance widened, and within just 9 months, it was over. Yet even in its ending, something about that love never fully disappeared. Because sometimes, the love that feels the strongest is also the one that asks you to become someone you are not. And Marilyn, perhaps for the first time, began to understand a painful truth. Being loved was not the same as being understood. The man who saw her mind, not her pain. Arthur Miller. After the intensity and heartbreak of her marriage to Joe DiMaggio, Marilyn Monroe began to look for something different. Not protection, not control, but understanding. She found that possibility in Arthur Miller. Miller was not like the men she had known before. He was thoughtful, intellectual, and deeply respected, a playwright whose words carried weight far beyond Hollywood. To Marilyn, who had long struggled to be taken seriously, he represented something she had quietly longed for: respect. Their connection felt deeper, more meaningful. Conversations replaced silence. Ideas replaced expectations. And for a time, Marilyn believed she had finally found a man who could see beyond the image the world had created for her. They married in 1956. It wasn't just a union of two people. It felt like a transformation. Marilyn Monroe, the symbol, was now becoming Marilyn Monroe, the woman. Someone who wanted to be valued, not for how she looked, but for who she was. But slowly, something began to change. Behind the calm surface of their marriage, doubts quietly formed. Miller, despite his admiration for her, struggled with the realities of her vulnerability. The pressures of fame, her emotional sensitivity, and the complexities of her life began to weigh heavily on him. Then came a moment that would quietly break something inside her. Marilyn discovered notes Miller had written, private reflections where he expressed disappointment, even uncertainty about their marriage. Words never meant for her eyes, but impossible to forget once seen. For Marilyn, the pain was deeper than anger. It was the realization that even the man who understood her mind could not fully accept her heart. Their relationship continued for a time, but something essential had shifted. The trust, the quiet belief that she had finally been seen for who she truly was, had begun to fade. By the time they worked together on The Misfits in 1961, their marriage was already nearing its end. The film, heavy with emotion, felt less like a collaboration and more like a farewell. And when it ended, so did they. Because sometimes being understood in words is not the same as being held in truth. And for Marilyn, that difference would stay with her long after the love was gone. The love that felt real, then faded. Yves Montand. By the late 1950s, Marilyn Monroe was no longer searching for perfection in love. Too much had already been lost for that. What she longed for now was something simpler, something that felt alive in the moment. And for a brief time, she found that feeling with Yves Montand. They met during the filming of Let's Make Love in 1960. Montand was charming, confident, and carried a European ease that felt different from the structured world Marilyn had grown used to. Around him, there was less pressure to be an icon and more space to simply exist. Their connection developed naturally. There was laughter on set, quiet conversations between scenes, a kind of warmth that didn't demand anything more than presence. For Marilyn, who had grown used to complicated love, this felt refreshingly uncomplicated. And perhaps that was what made it so powerful. For a while, she wasn't trying to be understood. She wasn't trying to be accepted. She was simply feeling something real again. But reality, as it often had in her life, was never far behind. Yves Montand was not alone in the world. He was married to the celebrated French actress Simone Signoret, a woman of strength, talent, and deep emotional presence. What had begun as a quiet, private connection soon became something far more complicated. Whispers spread, attention grew, and the simplicity that had once defined their bond slowly began to disappear. For Marilyn, this was a pattern she knew too well. A love that begins in secrecy rarely survives in the light. As the film wrapped, so did the relationship. Montand returned to his life. The world moved forward, and Marilyn, once again, was left with something that had felt real, but was never meant to last. There was no dramatic ending, no final confrontation, just distance. And perhaps that was the hardest part, because sometimes the most painful loves are not the ones that break loudly, but the ones that quietly fade, leaving behind only a memory of how they once made you feel. The man who stayed close, but never stayed. Frank Sinatra. By the early 1960s, Marilyn Monroe had begun to move through a different kind of emotional landscape. The intense romances, the broken marriages, the quiet disappointments, they had all left their mark. What remained was a deeper awareness of how fragile love could be. And somewhere within that space, there was Frank Sinatra. Sinatra was unlike the others. Charismatic, powerful, and endlessly connected, he moved through the world with a confidence that few could match. His voice filled concert halls, his presence dominated every room, and his friendships reached into the highest levels of influence. Yet with Marilyn, his connection was different. There was no formal beginning, no clear declaration of love. Instead, there was closeness, late-night conversations, shared laughter, and a familiarity that felt easy in a way many of her relationships had not. Sinatra understood the pressures of fame. He knew what it meant to live under constant attention, to carry expectations that never truly faded. In many ways, he and Marilyn spoke the same emotional language, and for a time, that understanding brought them together. He offered her support during difficult moments. She found comfort in his presence. Around him, she didn't need to explain herself, something that had been missing in so many parts of her life. But even then, something held it back. Frank Sinatra was a man who lived freely, rarely tied down by one place or one person. His life moved quickly, filled with music, friendships, and constant motion. And while he cared for Marilyn, there was always a distance, an invisible line that neither of them fully crossed. For Marilyn, that distance mattered, because by this point in her life, she was no longer searching for attention. She was searching for something steady, something lasting. And Sinatra, for all his warmth, could not offer that. Their connection remained undefined, somewhere between friendship and something more. But it never became the kind of love Marilyn had spent her life hoping to find. Because sometimes, even when two people understand each other, they are not meant to stay. And once again, Marilyn was left with a familiar feeling, close to love, but never quite held by it. The attention that wasn't love. John F. Kennedy. By 1962, Marilyn Monroe was no longer just a Hollywood star. She had become something larger, an icon recognized across the world, admired not only for her beauty, but for the mystery that seemed to surround her. And during this time, her name became linked to one of the most powerful men in America, President John F. Kennedy. Their connection has long been discussed, often surrounded by speculation, whispers, and unanswered questions. But beyond the headlines and public fascination, what mattered more was what that connection represented in Marilyn's life. It was not stability. It was not safety. It was attention, and for someone who had spent so much of her life searching for love, attention could sometimes feel dangerously close to it. The moment the world would never forget came on May 19, 1962, at Madison Square Garden. Standing under the spotlight, Marilyn stepped onto the stage and softly sang, "Happy Birthday, Mr. President." The room fell silent. It was intimate, almost fragile, a performance that felt less like entertainment and more like something personal. To the audience, it was unforgettable. To history, it became iconic. But behind that moment, there was a quieter truth. This was not a love story. There were no promises, no future, no place where Marilyn could belong. Whatever existed between them lived in secrecy, shaped by distance and circumstance. And in that space, something essential was always missing: to be chosen. Because attention can feel powerful, it can feel intoxicating, it can even feel like love. But in the end, it does not stay. And for Marilyn, that realization came with a quiet weight. She had been seen. She had been desired. But once again, she had not been held. Because sometimes the most painful truth is not that love disappears. It's that it was never really there to begin with. The one man who never left, Joe DiMaggio. In the end, after all the love Marilyn Monroe had known, it was not the most passionate nor the most glamorous that remained. It was the quiet one, the one she could not live with, and yet the one who never truly left her. Joe DiMaggio. Their marriage had been short, difficult, marked by differences neither of them could overcome at the time. He wanted a private life. She belonged to a world that would never let her be unseen, and that tension had pulled them apart. But what remained was something neither of them fully understood back then. After their divorce, DiMaggio stayed away from the spotlight. He did not speak publicly about her. He did not try to rewrite their story. Instead, he remained quietly present in a way that few people ever noticed. And as the years passed, that quiet presence became something more meaningful. When Marilyn struggled, he reached out. When her life grew more uncertain, he was still there in the background, steady, unchanged, and protective in a way that no longer demanded control. And then, in 1962, everything came to an end. Marilyn Monroe died at just 36 years old. The world reacted with shock. Headlines spread across countries. Questions filled the air. But while the world tried to understand what had happened, Joe DiMaggio did something very different. He stepped forward. He arranged her funeral. He kept it small, private, away from the chaos that had followed her throughout her life. He made sure that even in death, she was given a kind of dignity the world had rarely allowed her in life. And then, quietly, he continued. For the next 20 years, DiMaggio sent roses to her grave, again and again, without attention, without explanation, not for the world to see, but because he had never truly let go. He never remarried. He never spoke much about her. But in the silence of his actions, something became clear. This was not a perfect love. It had failed in life, but in its own way, it endured. And perhaps that was the truth Marilyn came closest to understanding. That sometimes the love that cannot survive in the moment becomes the one that lasts the longest in memory, the one that stays, even after everything else has gone. The life of Marilyn Monroe reminds us that even the most admired lives can carry the quiet weight of longing. Behind the beauty, the fame, and the unforgettable moments was a woman searching for something simple, love that felt real, steady, and lasting. And perhaps that is the truth her story leaves behind. Not all love stories are meant to last, but some are meant to stay with us forever. If you enjoy stories like this, about the hidden lives, quiet truths, and lasting legacies of classic Hollywood, consider subscribing. There are many more stories still waiting to be told.